please remain in the room as we are about to have a repeated and regular speaker, Mrs. Clémence Poirier. She will tell us about the dynamics of cyber conflicts and space systems in the war in Ukraine. I had the chance to moderate your last conference last year. You're our specialist of the war in Ukraine from a cybersecurity perspective. When we invited you in 2023, you were a research fellow at the European Space Policy Institute, a think tank based in Vienna, and now you're a senior cyber defense researcher at ETH Zürich, also known as Poly. Congratulations. I will stop talking there and leave the floor to you. You're all equipped.
Thank you very much. I will definitely talk about some of the cyber attacks that happened as part of the war in Ukraine. I guess you all know about CYSAT, but raise your hand if you know about the other attacks that happened afterwards. A few hands raised. Perfect. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Of course, it's only publicly documented attacks. There's probably a lot more that happened, but we don't really know about them yet. Let's start with the first one. So after the CYSAT hack, several attacks on Starlink happened, but there's not so many publicly documented attacks on Starlink. But one of them was, and actually came from the pro-Russian hacker group Killnet, which is specialized in DDoS attacks. And what they did is that they targeted the Starlink user interface. Their attack succeeded, and it ended up preventing users from using satellite communication. Users could not log in on the Starlink user interface. It blocked the application programming interface as well as Starlink databases. So it really had several hours of impact, and some users were even reporting online that they could not use the service. So here it's important to understand that it's not the satellite themselves that were targeted, but it's really the user interface. But still, that was enough to prevent users from using satellite. Then, on the other side, several attacks also coming from Ukrainian groups, most notably the Ukrainian group One Fist recounted its first attack that they named Operation Polaris. And this is a very interesting attack. They targeted the SATIS satellite network, which is a SATCOM service in Russia that provides connectivity to the oil and gas sector, the mining industry, the hydroelectric industry. So this attack actually impacted critical infrastructure. And so what did they do? What they did is that they actually broke into the network at Unix level. They accessed the operating system. They modified all the settings of the modems. They hid into the network like a Trojan horse, and they were waiting for the Russian operators to repair and counter the attack. And once the Russian operators were halfway done with dealing with the attack, they triggered the same attack again. And they did this several times. And so it took a lot of times for the operators to actually reboot everything, and in the end, 12 user terminals were rendered unusable and disconnected for several hours. And once again, the satellite in orbit was not affected, but only the user segment. And you will see throughout the presentation that it's a recurring target. They didn't stop there, so they continued with another operation that they called Operation Pleiad, and with a different operational mode this time. So what was super interesting is that they didn't target the satellite in orbit, they didn't target the user terminals. Here they targeted the CRM database, so the customer database. And they managed to enter the Gonets satellite network, which is also a Russian SATCOM network, and they gained operator-level access to the network because of a misconfiguration error. And they wanted at the beginning to take control of this database and download it, but they couldn't do it because there was a strong firewall, and they also explained that the Russians were actually very closely monitoring the network. So they were trying to do something with this CRM database, and the only option that was possible was to delete it. And it actually had an immediate effect, because what they realized is that each time customers were sending commands or receiving data from the satellite, the CRM database was checked to see whether they were actual customers with an active account. So something that was built for increased security and to prevent free riders on the network ended up being a very weak point, because all the customers could not use the system anymore. And so there was temporary loss of communication for several hours, and it impacted 97 Russian government organizations and companies. Again, no satellite in orbit targeted. And then they did a third attack that they called Operation Cataclysm, which this time targeted the Megaphone satellite network. Megaphone is a major internet service provider in Russia. And here, they saw that there was a lot of traffic, mobile traffic, that was going through two satellite communications on Megaphone's network. And so what they did is that they managed to log in as administrator into this network. They modified the settings. They deleted all the configurations on the routers because they targeted the user modems. And so they deleted everything. And what they did is they actually tried to deceive the Russian operators because they deleted all the configurations, but they created a malicious one that they called factory default to trick the Russian operators into rebooting the system and use this factory default thing instead. But it was a trap. And so it disconnected the modems and it disabled LAN settings. And what they did, similarly to the previous attack, is that they remained into the network. And each time the Russian operators were trying to fix the issue and kick them out of the networks, they triggered with the same attack again. And they did this several times. So in the end, it took 30 hours for the Russian operators to fix the issue. And so, of course, throughout this time, communication was lost. And one aspect that One Fist explained is that those user modems that you see, they're manufactured in Belgium. So what they said is like it's probably quite likely that they cannot even replace them because of the sanctions. So I thought that was quite interesting. And once again, no satellite in orbit targeted. It was just a user segment, and that was enough. Now another type of attack, because the cybersecurity of the space sector is not just the space system themselves, but also websites. And you probably noticed that the Roscosmos website since the beginning of the war in Ukraine was down, but it was unclear who was targeting it each time. And one attack was actually documented, and it came from Anonymous and one of their hackers named Vogelsek. And what this guy did is that he targeted the Roscosmos website as well as the Russian Space Research Institute website, which is managed also by Roscosmos. Defaced the website with DDoS, and he also managed to retrieve data. How did he manage to do this? He managed to retrieve data by brute force attack because they had weak passwords, and he then provided a link to download those files. Not really clear whether those files are actually legit. They were talking about some kind of lunar project, but still, even if that was not critical information in them, that's still a major security issue for Roscosmos. And just for the context with the little message that they put, that was at the beginning of the war after the US took sanctions on the Russian space sector. And then, if you remember, the former head of Roscosmos, Rogozin, he kind of threatened to stop operation on the ISS. So that's why, that was just after this. So that's why the hacker mentions the ISS. So you see there's sometimes a bit of correlation between what's happening on the ground, decisions of countries and decision makers, and what hackers are doing. Another type of attack that we can notice is at some point there were claims from this hacker named Lab 666, which is not really affiliated to any hacker groups as far as we know, claimed on a Russian-speaking hacker forum that he had access to credentials of a Maxar satellite. And he was willing to sell this credential for $15,000. And he proposed to prospective buyers to pay through an escrow account. Of course, it's a bit unclear whether that was actually true and he had really those credentials and if someone actually tried to buy anything. But it really shows that Earth observation companies are really targeted because Maxar, of course, provides images to Ukraine. And again, the satellite in orbit was not targeted, so you don't need to target the satellite in orbit to affect a satellite company or a space system. Now, the last example, there was in January 24 reports from the main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Ukraine, GUR. They attributed an attack to one of their teams, BO team, which was quite unknown at the time. And they claimed that they conducted an attack on the Russian Far Eastern Scientific Research Center of Space Hydrometeorology planet. And so they reported that this team managed to get into the center's data servers and get into the network, and they managed to affect and get into the servers, and they deleted 200 million gigabytes of satellite and meteorological data. So it was really a massive impact. And of course, you need meteorological data for your military operation. That's an essential aspect. But the attack did not just target the servers, so what they target is the data centers. It also widespread across the center, so it affected the supercomputers, it affected the normal computers of employees on the center, it actually affected the air conditioning systems, the power supply systems, the humidification systems of the building, and even spread to the center station on Bolshevik Island in the Arctic, which GUR said that was highly contributing to the missions of the Russian Ministry of Defense. So probably there was no segregation at all in their networks, and so it really widespread. And what the main Directorate of Intelligence explained is that probably a lot of the capacity of that centers will not be even possibly repaired, because a lot of the components would have to be physically repaired and replaced, and because of the sanctions, they will have difficulties replacing them. So again, the satellite themselves were not targeted. It was more like the software supply chain. And here, GUR explained also, as you can see on the image, the clients of that centers. And as you can see, the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Emergency Situations, the General Staff of the Armed Forces, Roscosmos, etc. So this was really a center that is providing services and that data to both civilian and military actors. So that's it for a bit the few examples. There's a bit of other examples, but I cannot mention everything. What we can learn about all those attacks? What does it say about conflicts in space, conflict on Earth, etc.? The first thing is that we can say that the weaponization of outer space is still emerging, because there's not really any attack that targeted the space system in orbit. Most of the attacks targeted the user segment, the user interface, so cyber conflicts extended to space system, but it didn't extend it to the orbital environment per se. So the weaponization of outer space, which means the placement of weapons in space, is still something that is emerging. It's not really completely there yet. There's not a full-blown war in space. What we can see as well in this conflict is that incident response and processes for coordination with authorities are not super clear for startup operators and new space companies. So typically, the example of Maxar, Earth observation company, when they have an attack or something like this happening, they're freaking out a bit because they don't know what are the processes, who to contact in case of attack, who is doing the attribution, if there's a counterattack decided by the government, who is doing it and how, and so on. So a few Earth observation companies, including in the US, kind of freaked out and alerted the governments at the beginning of the war because they didn't know, they never faced such a situation. And this is really important because attacks are really on the rise. The number of attacks on space systems is skyrocketing. And this is because this conflict really showed how there is a pervasive dependence to space systems, and this was mentioned several times since the beginning. It's for everyday lives, it's so essential for military operations, and threat actors, hacker groups, they didn't really know about this before. And now it's completely obvious, so they target space systems because they are space systems, and because they are so useful in military operations. So that's really important to see. Now, one thing is important to mention is that private actors in this conflict, they're not bound by long-term foreign policy objectives like states, and they can change their mind overnight. So when there is, for instance, Elon Musk that cuts the Starlink service for drone attacks or in specific geographical area, there's a strategic autonomy issue for Ukraine because that's all they have. They don't have their own satellites. So you have a sort of deny of service from the service provider itself. So that's something that should be kept in mind for military in Europe, because a lot of countries in Europe do not have their own satellites, let alone military ones. One other thing that we can notice in this conflict is that cybersecurity protocols and solutions that are now commonplace on computers on Earth, they're not really implemented on satellite services and in space companies. So we noticed that there were a lot of brute force attacks on Starlink accounts from Russia, and because people were trying to log into Starlink, and they managed to do so because there was no multi-factor authentication on Starlink's user interface. So that's something that is a bit of a detail, but sometimes that's really important. So it still shows that the space sector is still catching up on cybersecurity. So that's also because cyber threats on space systems were long overlooked by operators and manufacturers, so we need to catch up. It's improving, but still important to mention. Now, the most interesting, the threat actors and how they behave. I spent a lot of time on Telegram and looking at what those hackers are saying and how they communicate. And what we see is that there's not really a hacker group that is dedicated entirely at targeting space systems. Usually they target other things. In fact, quite on the contrary, they're quite new to the space sector. They don't really know the space sector very well. For instance, OneFist, they explained that it was their first attacks on satellites, that it took them a lot of time to understand how it works, that satellite networks are very complex, that it took them a lot of time to see how to find vulnerabilities and exploit them. You see also sometimes on Telegram channels, they would say, oh, we hacked the ground station. And then you look a bit into it and you're like, no, actually, that's the user modem. So you see a bit that they're new to the space sector. And maybe in the future, we'll see some groups that are actually developing and specializing in targeting this kind of systems, but it's not there yet. One other thing that we can notice in terms of hackers' behaviors is that sometimes their behaviors may be misaligned or conflict with the state that they support. So for instance, when you have Elon Musk that gives his opinion on Twitter about the conflict, sometimes those hacker groups, they disagree with him and they would say, oh, let's hack him or hack Starlink in retaliation because of what he said. But those hackers, sometimes they're pro-Ukraine, they're supporting Ukraine, but at the same time, the Ukrainian government, they cannot afford to lose Starlink even for several hours because they only have this. So sometimes you have two groups, two actors that are on the same side, but their behaviors may collide or be misaligned for some moments. So when you integrate hacker groups into your operation, it's rarely completely organized and hierarchical, and it's a bit of a mess sometimes. So that's something to keep in mind also for military in Europe. And of course, how did I manage to find those attacks that I mentioned before is because they're self-attributions. And this is something that is very new. 5 years ago, there were none of this. So threat actors are claiming their own attacks. And on both sides, they do this. But the way in which they're doing it is a bit different. So for instance, Ukrainian groups, they would be very detailed in their operational mode, in their motives, how they did the attack and why. And whereas Russian groups, they're also claiming attacks, but usually they're providing the proof that it really happened, but they don't really describe how they did it or their operational mode. So I think that's something that is also quite interesting. That's it for me. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clémence, for this insightful presentation. We do not have questions from the room yet, so time for mine. You were talking about the versatility of private actors who can change their minds overnight. That was your words, but also their governance, the governance of hacking groups, who do not have a specified governance. Still, you managed to join their Telegram chains thanks to self-attribution that they do. Would you recommend a space commandment to connect with those hacking groups? Would you also, other option, recommend to have integrating hacking groups within national forces?
Okay, so I don't interact with those groups, but usually their Telegram channels or their forums, they're open to anyone. So you don't need to join a private channel. Probably there are some of them, but they want to publicize their attacks. For them, they're making a statement with their attack. So it's important for them to make this public, so anyone can see those Telegram channels online. You don't need even to have a Telegram account. They will not see your phone number or username or anything. So you can just like read what they publish, which is sometimes very weird. And for us in research, it's sometimes very difficult because, of course, it's not PR like a government. So sometimes they would, you have a lot of memes and GIFs and private jokes and insults, and sometimes they're saying things like, oh, we poisoned the ground station to death or something like this. So sometimes it's a bit difficult to say, okay, how did you do it? Was it the malware? Was it something else? So the sequence of attack, sometimes it's a bit difficult to actually understand the operational mode in full. Sometimes they also do not provide all the informations, but yeah, that's a statement for them. And then, of course, for the second part of your question, Space Commands, they have to do their cyber threat intelligence. They have to have a map of the vulnerabilities, the threat actors. That was very well documented this morning from the presentation from NSA. You have to know who your enemies are, what they do, how they behave, and so on. So of course, I don't know how it works. You would have to ask Space Commands, but if they interact with those people. But it's important to monitor what they're doing so that you can protect your systems.
Thank you. We have questions from the room now, from Laurence Ducroix, who's asking, is there any available analysis information on the recent attack on satellite TV channel in NL, which transmitted Russian video for some seconds?
I'm not aware of this one, so I cannot say. This is something that usually is more electronic warfare than cyber warfare. This is something that happened several times in Russia as well, where satellite TV channels are interrupted, and this happened regularly, and it happened also before this conflict. So it happened to TV5 Monde, for instance. It happened with where some terrorist organizations also hijacked satellite TV channels. Also, sometimes it's just users that just want to watch satellite TV channels for free. So that's a common type of attack.
Mm-hmm. We talked earlier with Major General about the absence of sanctions of regulations. We have another question related to this from Alessandra De Angelis. Is there a cybercrime framework one can refer to with a view to criminalize the conduct of private actors performing cyber attacks?
So that's something that is in the work at the UN, where they were trying to have some kind of treaty on cybercrime, and but that was not specific to the space sector. It was really generalized. Then, of course, in each country in the EU, you have laws for cybercrime, but they're not related to the space sector. They can apply to the space sector sometimes, but you don't have dedicated frameworks for cybercrime on space systems. And I don't think there necessarily should be one. I think general cybercrime frameworks could be adapted to the space sectors in many cases.
Okay. And still, you said that space sector is still catching up on cybersecurity. Are there any provisions you would like to see in the future EU initiatives for space law?
$1 million question. It's hard to say. I guess we'll see where this EU space law will go. Already it's a big step. I think that they, from the very beginning, wanted to integrate cyber resilience measures, and that they had a broad consultation with the industry, academia, and public actors on this, because it's very important to have, I think, primary rules and primary principles rather than specifying in a law very specific technologies, because this law is supposed to be not necessarily timeless, but at least be valid for several years. And if you mention a specific technology or specific solution and so on, and then innovation comes and law cannot catch up with the technological innovation. So I think I would expect some general principles on cybersecurity, also something that is consistent with NIS2 directive, so that the two laws do not contradict each other. I think that's also very important, and some aspects also of the NIS2 directive. Of course, this is very generalized. It's not adapted to the space sector, so that maybe the EU space law could clarify some of the rules of the NIS2 directive by taking into account the specificities of the orbital environment and how it changes things for cybersecurity in space.
We have now many questions popping up and only 2 minutes left. One from Allard de Bourget. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. Do you see any synchronization between military and cyber operations, or are threat actors acting on their own? And maybe I will bind it to another question from Benjamin Auger. Russian aggression in Ukraine has revealed and polarized cyber criminal groups and the widespread use of OSINT. Is it now simpler to investigate these attacks?
It's hard to say, in the sense that it really showed and shed the light on many groups which were a bit unknown, where it was a bit difficult to see where they were, because of course you have some hacker groups that are mercenaries. As long as you pay, they target whatever. Some groups that are very political and they would support one side. Some hacker groups that are really linked to security agencies and governments, and they just take orders from them. Sometimes government also subcontract things to proxies to kind of mislead the attribution process and so on. So I think the war in Ukraine really demonstrated and managed to clarify a lot of how some groups position themselves. It also showed that some groups, like Killnet, for instance, that kind of reoriented their strategy, going from cybercrime and mercenariat to really being very politicized and supporting one side in the conflict. So you can check Twitter account. So there's a guy, I don't know him, but he's making maps and updating them about the different hacker groups on each side of the conflict. Not specific to space, but it's very informative. So I think the USINT community is providing a lot of information on social media about threat actors' behavior.
Okay. I think we can take one more question from François-Marie Le Savre, who asked, from the observation that attacks and target ground segment, do you consider that this is the major vulnerability and the best cost impact target?
Definitely the user segment and ground segments are one of the most targeted segment. Also because I guess this is easier than targeting the space segment. And it's also, as the attack shows, sometimes it's not really necessary to have the hassle of targeting the system in orbit. So targeting the ground segment and the user segment is enough to make the system stop and to prevent users from using the service. So why bother, I would say. So this is also, the ground segment and user segments are also crippled with vulnerabilities. So it's also very easy for threat actors to find vulnerabilities and exploit them. And they're also very similar to other vulnerabilities that you find on computers, normal computers on Earth. Whereas for the space segment, it's a bit different. So it's a bit more complicated, and you would need more knowledge about space to fully exploit them.
Thank you very much, Clémence. I'm sorry for the person who asked question. We do not have time for that right now.